Hello, everyone. Welcome to Truthzilla. I'm Megan, sitting here with Scott and Ed. Hi, guys.
What up?
How are you doing today?
Great.
Yeah.
Doing awesome.
Doing awesome. How are you guys feeling about what's going on with our world right now?
It's pretty crazy. It's pretty crazy. We'll get into that.
Yeah, I would like to touch on some things.
Ed's chomping at the bit to touch on stuff. Absolutely. I just wanted to get some business out of the way.
Cool.
And we're not selling anything. We don't have any advertisers, nothing like that. But I just want to give a shout out. You know, Truthzilla, we're going hard in the paint, man. And we're trying to get the word out as much as possible. And we've already seen that the algorithms are not letting that happen. So if you guys do us a favor, like tell your friends about it. You know, talk to your friends, tell your coworkers, your neighbors, like, hey, these guys are onto something here. Spread the show. It's word of mouth that's going to get this thing out because, you know, the algorithms will not do it.
Absolutely.
We've noticed a significant, like, oh, these guys are talking about vaccines next week? No.
Yep.
So interesting. It's very interesting to see how that on the back end, how that works. So just spread it with your friends. You know, come join us on Facebook. Join us on Facebook at Truthzilla, Twitter at Truthzilla, Truthzilla Pod, at Truthzilla Pod on Twitter, on Instagram, Truthzilla, and you know, we drop fire memes and all things to get you through these end times, you know.
Yes.
So just you know, come join us. Come join the Truthzilla Mind Militia.
Truthzilla Mind
Yes.
Militia, and that is so true.
Yep.
Pretty
Come
appropriate
with
for
us.
today's
Yep.
topic as well, I would say.
Absolutely.
Yep. So also wanted to give a shout out to our friend Sean, who has his own podcast called The World Series of Conspiracy, TWOSC.
Nice.
No, TWSOC. He's over on, you can find him on all the podcast platforms, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, man. He's got a real cool thing going on. Yours truly, I was actually a guest on his podcast a couple weeks ago, and we did what was called the Encyclopedia Conspirica. Now, I thought I had a little bit of knowledge about conspiracies, but I tell you what, Sean was like, I was just like, oh my God, he goes hard. So he basically separated 4 categories of like about 200 conspiracies. Ones that are, you know, accepted, proven, true, 100%, no questions asked. I can't remember the titles of each topic, but I can't remember. But the second one was like, you know, maybe, you know, reasonably, you know, could be realistic. The third one was like highly contentious, and the third one was just reckless speculation. You know, we get into lizard people, we get into mud floods, dude. Like, it's a fun podcast. So check out the World Series of Conspiracies, man. That's a really good show. So, yeah. So, what's going on, Ed?
Okay, so I did want to touch on just a couple of things going on in the world, you know, and we talked about vaccines last week, and which is, you know, near and dear to me. So there's just, you know, at least one study that came out that I thought was that you should all know about. So basically they did a study of, it was a little over 2,000 children, I believe. I think there was about 30% of them were unvaccinated and 70% were vaccinated, but they were looking... Basically, they found correlations between developmental delays, asthma, ear infections, and gastrointestinal disorders. We will put the link in here so you can look it up yourself and read the study, but it's just more proof. More proof, look into it. On the same note, this is actually not the most current news, but I do want to touch on it too, that just with the coronavirus, you know, I mean, I think that we can all agree the things happening in our world right now are making us crazy.
Yeah.
And on that note, like, just they tend to contradict themselves all of the time, you know. Like, you can't like really put out fake science and like get away with it. So one of the things that happened, it's about 10 days ago now, but the let's see, what was her name? The Maria Van Kerkhove of the World Health Organization came out and basically said, where's the wording of hers? The spread of COVID-19 by someone who is not showing symptoms appears to be rare. There you have it, folks. Now, you'll say, yeah, but the very next day she walked that back.
Wonder why that is.
And I would really encourage you, if you're anyone like us, just go read the walk back, because if you look at, like, there's this thing that keeps happening, like, here's what the data says, but if you look at these models, the models is what got us into this whole heap of shit, you know? Mm-hmm. So, anyways, as soon as you see the word model, like, that, for me, that's like a bell goes off, like, okay, they're full of shit.
Absolutely.
That's what they're saying at this point. So, So anyways, I just thought we should touch on that, and I would, again, encourage you, we'll put some links in, but watch the walk back, because if you're in my shoes, it's hysterical.
That just tells me like her family probably got threatened. Like, yo, you can't be saying that. Okay, I'm sorry.
She got threatened.
I meant this instead, right?
Oh, yeah.
Something like that, right?
Yep. Yeah, she dealt with some fire over
Well,
this.
and I think this comes back to a theme that we've talked about several times on here. Is it doesn't take that many strings to pull these things off.
Mm-hmm.
And you look at like the situation we're in. Like how many world leaders right now, if they were to admit that these things that they were wrong about these
Right.
things, walking it back isn't an option.
There's no way. They can't undo it. They can't unsay it. And so they're trying like hell to hang on to any tiny piece of credibility. And I mean, I feel that they have none.
Nice.
I mean, I haven't felt that they've had any to begin with, but as time has gone on, I think it seems to be pretty blatantly clear that they know friggin'
That's
clue.
just a
and
classic ongoing strategy. Like,
That's
just deny, and then double down when
That's
you're caught
it.
in a lie.
Yep. God.
And come with us, we'll show you the way.
Yeah.
You know?
Just follow us. We have the answers.
Yep. So next week, tune in. We're gonna do a whole COVID-19 fiasco, dude. I uncovered
I cannot wait.
I uncovered some shit last night, and I really just want to say it right now. But like, oh my god.
Yeah.
Come check it out
We're
next
gonna
week.
go deep on
Please.
it.
Yeah.
We're gonna go deep on it.
Yep. And this is like original research that I came up with last night. I'm super excited. I really want to say it. Like,
And I will
I want you to say it.
intelligence agencies. Look at the intelligence agencies.
Okay.
We're
all
not
right.
going to go totally into it right now, but I do want to just preface with the fact that what I think that a lot of people get on like conspiracy theorists about or whatnot, you know, is like, well, what's the ultimate goal? We're going to tell you the ultimate goal next week.
No.
Next, we're going to get into the goal of what this agenda is all about.
Yep.
Biosecurity state. And look how much money they're pouring into it. In QTEL. Anyway. So, check it out next week. So, speaking of intelligence agencies, you guys saw it. You know what it is. It's time to dive into it. You cannot have a conspiracy show without the obligatory MK Ultra episode. And so we're just getting ours out of the way up front. So here we go, ladies and gentlemen. This is the story of MK Ultra. Now, you may have heard of it. You may not have heard of it. It may sound like something out of a comic book, right? Like MK, it just sounds like one of those like can't possibly be true. And the more we get into it, the more it seems like there's no way that it could possibly be true, you know? And it really is
the more you get into,
insane.
the more you really can't deny that it is actually very true. I mean, it's both of those. Like, you
Yeah.
can't even believe what you're finding out. You can't even believe this has gone on. And also, you really can't deny it. I mean,
Yeah.
It's all original sources, like black and white papers posted. You know, you can still find them archived, or you can find them out there online. Like, it's pretty readily available to find all this stuff. So look into it for yourself. But yeah, it's some pretty interesting stuff. But speaking of MK Ultra, so what is MK Ultra, right? So basically, MK Ultra is, in a nutshell, it's just a strategy that the intelligence agencies during the 50s up through the early 70s used to experiment on finding different mind control techniques. And we'll get into all the ins and outs of it. But I just wanted to point out something kind of interesting here. So the word government, if you break that word apart. Now, I also saw some things online that denied that this is true, but, you know, it's fun. It's fun to believe it's true.
We're going to go with it.
So gubernaire is the Latin word that derives the suffix govern, which is Latin for to steer, guide, or control. And ment, M-E-N-T, is from Latin M-E-N-T-E, mente, or the ablative version is mens. And both of those mean mind. And so you have steer, mind, control, mind. So literally the word government means mind control, you know, when you break it down. So,
Right.
you know,
Sounds
there we are.
Spot on.
It's right there in front of us. So I think in order to get a fair understanding of MK Ultra, it's important that we take it back just a little bit to, you know, the end of World War II and something called Operation Paperclip. So Operation Paperclip is, you know, that's another one that's out in the open. You know, there's no question about it. Towards the end of the war, the Soviets took Germany, and the Nazis, you know, the high command of Germany surrendered, right?
Right.
And so, you know, then you hear about the Nuremberg trials, right, where all the Nazis were, you know, either executed or put in prison, right? No, there was like less than 20. I think it was like 17 were
16,
on
17,
16,
I thought,
17
yeah.
were in the Nuremberg trials, and I think 11 were hanged or 11 were in prison, something like that. But anyway, that's it. The rest escaped to South America and throughout the rest of the world. And
Most of us didn't know that.
Yeah,
I think for
yeah.
like a long, I didn't
Yep.
know that until like just very recently, actually.
And the rest of them were actually hired and put to work by the United States and the Soviets. So if you look into like Wernher von Braun, for example, who was the first head of NASA, he was a rocket scientist, head of the Nazi V2 rocket program. He was brought over to the United States and put in charge of NASA. And he was the head of NASA through all the Apollo missions. He was actually a major in the Nazi SS. And he served from, I believe, like 1937 until, So he was a high-ranking Nazi in the SS, right? And he just comes to work for the United States, and like there's like he goes on Walt Disney shows. Like there's a Walt Disney show called Tomorrowland, and so he's just like he's fine. He's a good guy, right?
Oh,
yeah. So in addition to absorbing all the rocket scientists who were high-ranking Nazis, there was also a whole crew that came over because the Nazis, man, that they were doing severe human experimentation. The Dr. Mengele stuff. You can look into that. It's some pretty scary stuff, but they we're doing all kinds of human experimentation. So, kind of the philosophy in the medical community is like they've adopted a lot of that stuff into medical practice. Like there's some ethical questions about that. Like, are we going to use all of Dr. Mengele's research to, we're going to use that in our, and so they've decided to do that, which, it is what it is. But like, it's really interesting too that at the time, at the end of World War II, the intelligence agency was called the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, which later became the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency. And so when we brought all these, so there was a total of there's different contradictory numbers, like between 1,100 and about 1,600 Nazis that came over and were given, new lives, green cards in the United States, relocated their entire families and given well-paying government jobs. And so a good example of that is a guy named Reinhard Gehlen. And so he was in charge of the Nazi intelligence service branch that was investigating the Soviets. So he, over the course of the war, had collected all this intelligence data on the Soviets, right? And a lot of the means in which they do that is they were just doing massive experimentation on the Soviet prisoners. And it said that he was in charge of torturing and murdering and starving up to 4 million Soviet prisoners during the time of the war, him and his crew. Yep. So as the end of the war was approaching, and now this might sound very kind of like the end of Inglourious Bastards. Like it's kind of the same story. So as it approached the end of the war, he realized that the Nazis were defeated, and him and his crew realized that if he fell into the Soviets' hands, then they would be in a lot of trouble. Mm-hmm. So what they did is they kind of bolstered their position and took all of their data, put them on microfilms for all the information that they had on the Soviets on the microfilms, and then stashed those somewhere and positioned themselves to where that they were captured by the Americans instead. Uh-huh. And they said, look, we've got all this data and all this information about the Soviets that we think you want to have, and in exchange, give us a job. And so that's basically Alan Dulles, who was the head of I think it was still the OSS at the time. I might be confused on that.
We did make them promise to be nice, though. From
they had to be nice from there on out.
I just want to make sure.
I mean, they said that they would after all. They said that they would, and so therefore...
Yeah.
They must have been.
Yeah. And so, he arranged for, or actually it appears that Alan Dulles, arranged for him to run an intelligence facility in West Germany and named it the Gehlen Organization. And so as a condition, Gehlen promised not to hire any former Gestapo SS soldiers, but they did it anyway. Yep.
And the CIA did nothing.
Yeah.
Nothing. And they were fine with it.
They kind of whitewashed. That's kind of the whole thing about Operation Paperclip in general, is that they kind of just whitewashed everybody's records. And I think that's where the term paperclip comes from, because they had all these dossiers, all these like personnel files on all these, Nazis that they were going to bring over, and the ones with like really bad records, they put a little paperclip on them. Like, well, we got to keep an eye for that guy. So, as addition to that, like Gehlen's organization apparently smuggled out, up to 5,000 Nazis. They helped do that. So one of these scientists that came over was a man named Kurt Blom, something like that. He was the deputy surgeon general of the Third Reich, the Nazi Party, and he was head of their biological warfare program. So over the course of that time, he conducted all kinds of experiments, involving the spreading of disease like insects, mosquitoes, lice, and he was trying to create a weaponized bubonic plague. And he had his colleague, Fritz Hoffmann, eventually, as told, helped develop Agent Orange, which we saw in the Vietnam War, causing all kinds of issues. So he did other experiments, including the use of psychedelics and LSD for mind control and behavior modification. And so these experiments they basically, the CIA saw that these were already in place, and they're like, oh, that's a great idea, and so they kind of adopted those into the CIA strategy. So it's kind of a rough breakdown. I may have gotten some dates wrong or some weird, this or that. But that's kind of the general idea, right?
Yep.
So they took what the Nazis were already doing, and in fear of what the Soviets were doing, they basically came up with this program, MK Ultra. So MK Ultra lasted from 1953 till 1973, at least on the record, right? And so there was a speech that Allen Dulles gave on April 10th, 1953 at the National Alumni Conference of the Graduate Council at Princeton University. And this was transcribed in a document that was declassified on 5/5/2003, which you'll find in the show notes. And basically, this is what he says.
Okay, I'm going to read this. The target of this warfare by the Soviets is the minds of men both on a collective and on an individual basis. Its aim is to condition the mind so that it no longer reacts on a free will or rational basis, but responds to impulses and planning from outside. If we are to counter this kind of warfare, we must understand the techniques that the Soviet is adopting to control men's minds. It is hard for us to realize that in the great area behind the Iron Curtain, a vast experiment is underway to change men's minds, working on them continuously from youth to old age. The Soviet experiment is very different. It takes on two forms. First, attempted mass indoctrination of hundreds of millions of people so that they... Sorry. I'm going to start over on that. First, the attempted mass indoctrination of hundreds of millions of people so that they respond docilely to the orders of their masters. Second, the perversion of the minds of select individuals who are subject to such treatment so that they are deprived of the ability to state their own thoughts. Parrot-like, the individual is conditioned so that they can... I've lost my place... repeat thoughts which have been implanted in their minds by suggestion from the outside, and affect the brain under the circumstance. Under this circumstance, becomes like a phonograph playing a disc on its spindle by an outside genius over which he has no control. To create conditions which permit the mass indoctrination of millions of people, certain prerequisites are necessary. In particular, it is necessary to close off with an impenetrable barrier the area within which the operation is to take place. It is the physical and spiritual barrier by which the Soviet Union has isolated itself and its satellites from the outside world.
Perfect. And I think that's, if you really look into what he's saying there, he's describing the diabolical things that these Soviets are doing. But if you pick it apart, it says, if we are to counter this kind of warfare, we must understand the techniques that the Soviets are adopting. So we have to figure this out for ourselves, right? So that was April 10th, 1953. And on April 13th, 1953, he signed off on the creation of Project MK Ultra.
Yeah.
So, it's also important to understand, this is in the midst of the Cold War, right? Now the Soviets, who were our allies during World War II, are all of a sudden our enemies, right? So, the powers that be had to create a new enemy, right? And it's the communists, the Soviets, right? And as you can see, very, emblematic of the space race, for example, right? It was who's going to get to the moon first? And that meant... who had the most political capital in the world, right? Mm-hmm. And so really nothing was off limits in terms of beating the Russians to the moon, or also figuring out what they're doing in terms of their their mind control techniques. And so the United States, they were so fearful of that they were going to come up with this, the goal being to, we'll get into it here in a minute. I guess we could just go to it right now. So it started off the predecessor to MK Ultra was what's called Project Paperclip, right? And so this also shows what they were trying to achieve, and basically it had four goals, right? The first one is the evaluation and development of any method by which we can get information from a person against his will or without his knowledge.
Yeah.
And number two, how can we counter these measures if they're used against us? And this is the one right here. This is the real one that stands out. Can we get control of an individual to the point where he will do our bidding against his will and even against fundamental laws of nature such as self-preservation? So
that's it.
How can we control a person's mind to the point where they will do whatever we tell them to do up and including the point where they actually end up dying in the process of doing what we're telling them to do? How do we control their mind on that level? That's the goal, right? And they're fearful that the Soviets are going to beat them to the punch. So, they have a term, a Manchurian Candidate, right? A Manchurian Candidate is kind of the term that's used to reference some sort of individual who has been programmed, to carry out whatever task it is that they're programmed to carry out.
Or the Winter Soldier for you Marvel fans.
Yeah. So that's a perfect example right there. So, they come out with a movie called back in, I think it was the 60s, right? The original Manchurian Candidate. Like they had the Denzel Washington one here more recently. Yeah. But I think it was Denzel. But anyway, so, that's a great trick that Hollywood does is they take these concepts and they make movies out of them to fictionalize it, right?
Yep.
So when someone comes out and says that, hey, did you know that the CIA has a program where they're like trying to program people to carry out assassinations? They're like, no, dude, that was a movie.
That's just on the TV.
Right? So that's a brilliant strategy.
It's such a common, regularly. I mean, right from the jump.
Yep.
Just to clarify, though, I think you said this is Project Artichoke.
That's
discussing.
What did I say? Did I say Artichoke?
You said Paperclip still.
Oh, Paperclip. I meant Artichoke. Yes. My bad. My misspoke there. Yeah. So Project Artichoke is the predecessor to MK Ultra. So anyway, Dulles gives this crazy speech about how we need to understand more fully what these Soviets are up to, and what better way to understand it than to do this program ourselves. So, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the head of MK Ultra was a gentleman named Sidney Gottlieb. Now, you may have heard of him. There's a really good book. The last name's Kinzer. It's a book called Poisoner in Chief that kind of breaks down. It's a fairly recent book. I think it came out like last year. Mm-hmm. Anyway, he was born in the 30s, and he went and got his degrees at the University of Wisconsin, at California Institute of Technology, and worked for various agencies during World War II. It was during this, and right before, in 1951, he was recommended for a job at the CIA. He joined the agency and became in charge in 1953 of MK Ultra. And so it also just really kind of, Kinzer's story, the Poisoner in Chief, kind of illustrates, how a lot of these Nazi scientists ended up working, directly under, like these people who should have been on trial, right? Then all of a sudden they're having these high-paid jobs, right? So
within the United States, with our help and support,
but we needed the technology.
We needed We needed to come up with.
And they promised to be nice.
They promised. Well,
they did promise to be nice, and I feel like that's really the key here. That was the pivotal moment for them to bring them over. Yeah. Absolutely.
So what kind of techniques did they use? I mean, what comes to mind when you guys hear like MK Ultra CIA mind control experiments, right?
Well, I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind, and I always go dark right away, would be like just psychosurgeries, like brain lesions and electrodes in the brain and brainwashing and traumatize. I mean, I feel like that psychological and spiritual traumatization is also right up there. I mean, the degree of trauma that you can inflict on an individual, especially a young individual, and the effects from that are mind-boggling.
Absolutely.
Mind-boggling.
Absolutely. So. Absolutely. I mean, those are all very key aspects of the program, right? A good documentary you guys can check out. It's by a couple that run a channel called Truthstream Media. It's called The Minds of Men. It's like almost 4-hour, just
3 hours
powerhouse movie.
It is
about that really gets into the real nuts and bolts of this thing and picks apart who's involved. It's a really, really kind of just like very standard documentary. When it comes to talking about this stuff, but. So
filled with great information.
Yeah.
You can play it on like 1.25 speed, and
get through
you'll like it for you.
Get someone.
They got me.
They got you. Oh damn. Let's see. Materials, substances that which will promote the intoxicating effects of alcohol. So yeah. All right. Whatever.
Materials which will produce the signs and symptoms of recognized diseases reversibly, so they may
be used for
malingering.
Yeah, I don't know.
Well, I heard a little bit about this. I think so you'd think you have like AIDS or something like that, but then it'd be like a few days later it'd be gone. So it'd give you these symptoms, so you'd think you'd have something.
Oh, that's
kind of the idea.
COVID-19.
Yeah, COVID-19. No doubt. We're gonna see little bits and pieces of this throughout our present day.
Oh gosh. Is that what's going on? I don't know.
100,000%.
Maybe. There's a little malingering going on.
2.5 billion%.
Okay, let's see. Materials which will cause temporary or permanent brain damage and loss of memory.
All right. Where are we at here? about substances which will enhance the ability of individuals to withstand privation, torture, and coercion during interrogation and so-called brainwashing. So the ability to withstand that's just diabolical.
I was reading about a younger girl actually and I was reading about a case study from a young woman today, and it's devastating even to read. It's trauma. It's what's that?
What was it?
So what you just said about I just dropped my train of thought. To withstand privation, to withstand pain, to withstand all of that. So this girl that's essentially she was all the way under, and she's hooked up to machines, and she can hear her torturer or her doctor telling her to do these direct commands while she's all the way unconscious. And because of the amount of brainwashing, the amount of programming that had been done to her at that point, she knew that if she didn't respond, even in her sleep state, in the way that she was being instructed, that she would receive these terrible racking electroshocks. And there was other doctors in the room that would come over to kind of see what this doctor was doing. And so something like, move your hand or, open your eyes, and this person's absolutely unconscious and then stated that, and so, when they would say like, think about something that makes you depressed. And so she would have to go there in her mind to produce certain brainwaves for them to see. And then they would say to be afraid, and she would go deep into all the things they'd done to her so she could produce these brainwaves. And they would tell her to be calm. And she said that was a really, really hard one for her to do because of, everything that had happened to her and what she knew would continue to come. But she would remember the end of these torture sessions, and that was her calm. So she would go there, and that would produce. Anyway, I went off on a tangent there, but I was just reading about that today, and it just struck me when you said it. But
it's not great. That's good. That's good. Damn, insane. So, all right. So materials and physical methods which will produce amnesia for events preceding and during their use. Pretty self-explanatory.
Physical methods of producing shock and confusion over extended periods of time and capable of private use.
Okay.
Substances which produce physical disablement, such as paralysis of the legs, acute anemia, and so forth.
Testing a variety of substances which will produce a chemical that can cause blisters.
What were we just saying?
Yeah.
Substances which alter personality structure in such a way the tendency of the recipient to become dependent upon another person is enhanced.
Weird.
So we're talking about like induced codependence, essentially.
Codependence.
Yeah. Great. That's what we all need.
Yep.
A material which will cause mental confusion, such as of such a type the individual under its influence will find it challenging to maintain a fabrication under questioning.
So truth serum.
Right.
Truth serum, right? Substances which will lower the ambition and general working efficiency of men when administered in undetectable amounts. So, wow, there's a lot of that going on.
That's
today.
heavy.
I'm going to see that everywhere I go. Right?
Substances which promote weakness or distortion of the eyesight or hearing faculties, preferably without permanent effects. Preferably.
I mean,
if it happens,
but if it happens, it happens.
Yeah, I mean, it's for
well,
science.
they promised at the start of all this it was going to be
nice
good.
Guys.
So,
trust your government.
Yes, trust your government. Oh, God. Okay, a knockout pill which surreptitiously administered in drinks, food, cigarettes, as an aerosol, etc., will be safe to use, provide a maximum of amnesia, and be suitable for use by agent types on an ad hoc basis.
Sure. So
why not?
Amnesia, just spray some amnesia everywhere in the room.
That's
right?
it. That's just a little blinky pin. Yep. That's all it is. It's just a little CIA blinky pin.
MK Ultra doesn't exist.
Yeah, exactly. Wink. Let's see. Finally, a material which can be surreptitiously administered by the above routes and which in minimal amounts will make it impossible for a person to perform physical activity. So, all right, there it is right there. That's what the church committee determined a lot of what the activities are that they were up to. Some other crazy stuff, man. Like, it's so crazy. They had all these different sub-projects. One of them, sub-project 142, the use of animals being used for delivery of biological and chemical weapons. So this is where the psychosurgeries and then tapping into the brain.
Yeah.
They were actually able to remote control these animals, or they were able to control these animals remotely
I was watching some footage of with the bull today. Have you guys seen that?
Yeah. So and you can just keep in mind.
I haven't seen this. Tell me about it.
I would have to send you. Okay, so you explain.
Mm-hmm, I've seen
You've
it.
seen
Go ahead.
So they put the electrodes in this like a bullfighting bull in his brain, and then who was it that was standing out with him? Was it one of the doctors? Was it somebody else?
Probably.
I was thinking it was the actual doctor, but at any rate, so there's this bull that's trained to charge and to fight, and they're out there with their what is it? Their red blanket. I don't remember what it's called. There's a specific name for it, but I don't know. At any rate, and so here's this bull ready to charge, and through remote control, like in the midst of this animal's determination to go for this man, they're able to do, and you see this bull like stop in its tracks, like literally almost like a car, when it hits its brakes and it kind of keeps moving to that degree, and like spinning around and being confused, and then they, let it.
And it's from electrodes in the brain.
Yep. They're just controlling it from, and this is the 1950s and 60s, guys. Like,
but don't worry, this was shut down long ago, and so it.
MK Ultra stopped immediately in 1953, and they've never done any research or any advancements in any of these areas ever again.
Of course
not. Not even the slightest bit. And so that kind of brings me to another thing, and this is where it's going to start to get a little dark, unfortunately. So,
let's do it.
But you know what? This is the truth, man. Like,
but we got to bring the dark to light.
The darkness has to come to the light, and it has to be, man. So we talked a little bit earlier about people, right, who were involved in the experimentations, right? Prostitutes, their clients, mental patients, convicted criminals, orphans. So the orphan thing, the biggest chunk I could find was that if you look up the Duplessis orphans, the Duplessis orphans, it happened in Canada, all right? And so it was basically, the estimates are around 20,000 children who were deemed, mentally ill, and it was exposed as a complete scam. Like, these kids were falsely diagnosed as being mentally ill and put in these orphanages to divert taxpayer funds, and to a lot of them ended up being the victims of experimentation. So at the time, the head of so this gentleman, Dr. Ewan Cameron, you can look him up. His credentials are, he was the president of the Canadian, American, and World Psychiatric Associations, the American Psychopathological Association. That's so funny. The American Psychopathological Association and the Society of Biological Psychiatry. So his claim to fame was that he was the one that evaluated Rudolf Hess, right, one of the high-ranking Nazis after the war, and determined that he was insane during the Nuremberg trials. He also operated at the Allen Memorial Institute and McGill University in Canada, who received direct funding from the Human Ecology Fund. So if you look up the Human Ecology Fund, that is kind of and I'll have links to this in the notes. Like, all this will have links in the notes. Document showing how the CIA established the Human Ecology Fund as a front for funneling money to these different, operations. Like, there was like MK Ultra stuff going on all over the country.
I think there was like 88 different satellite things they were using between. I mean, it was churches to universities, to,
over 80 different institutions, military, both
at
home and abroad, universities, military bases, VA hospitals.
You could never track the money,
right?
Because it was,
yeah,
and they didn't. A lot of times they didn't even know they were working for the CIA.
Yeah, right. That's a lot. Sometimes they did. They for sure, but a lot of times they did not.
They were doing these experiments. They were just presented, would you run these experiments? Because we don't have a lab.
Well, but and know this too, though, that none of the individuals that were ever experimented on were aware that they were being experimented on. There was no consent in any of these. I mean, thousands.
There was some consent in some of the drug stuff.
Yeah. There's footage of the guys tripping, but some of these extreme, like where they're taking Nazi stuff.
When they're saying that they're treating violent behaviors, or they're working on mental disorders or emotional disorders, these human beings were essentially being told that this was the way, when really they didn't have any. They had no idea. They had no idea. This was just experimentation on human beings for their sick purposes of mass control of tens of millions of people. So
absolutely. So there's a book called The Most Dangerous Game, which talks about Ewan Cameron's involvement with the MK Ultra stuff, which was going on in these and so with the orphans, it's hard to, it's said that he had direct involvement with that, but if not, he had absolute complicity. He was very complicit in the actual cover up of all of it. And there were survivors who, when they were adults, went back and said, hey, these are some sites where, children who were victims of experimentation who died were buried, and it's a big thing. So looking at the duplicitous orphan
and I just before I ask this question, this thing is so deep, and there's so many different pieces and whatnot. So I have a question, I guess. So is this the same guy? I know there was a guy in Canada. I'm guessing it's the same guy that they were doing. Did they call it psychic driving or brain driving? Where they would basically drug-induce comas, and then they would just feed loops of things into their brain. Like they just loop things to like try to see if they could get them to kill the president or whatever. Like they were trying to see if they could train people by, while they were in drug-induced comas, they were just repeating things over and
hundreds
over.
or thousands of hours.
It was up to 3 months is what they did on these things. I think it was that same person.
I'm not 100% sure exactly which, but that's definitely one of their techniques. It's called like ego death, right? Where they just destroy your mind with the hopes of building it back up, which is the basis of trauma-based mind control, which is what the Nazis had uncovered. Like Dr. Mengele was huge with trauma-based mind control. The idea, especially, and it's most effective for youth, right? It says like below the ages of 6. If you can traumatize the mind at that point and fracture it, then you can mold it the way you want. That's kind of the idea of trauma-based mind control, which is very much what this is about. And so, as an adult, it's a lot more difficult to fracture an established mind. And so that kind of just, that transitions right into the next little topic here. And so, have you guys ever heard of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation?
Just in the
recently.
Yeah.
Okay.
I forgot.
Okay, I forgot.
Cute.
Good,
I
dude.
like it.
Good, dude. So, the False Memory Syndrome Foundation was founded in 1992, right? What you had here was you had a lot of people, and it was started by one individual, a gal who, she blamed her parents. She, as an adult, she came and she accused her father of molesting her as a child. Her mom and dad steadfastly denied it, and said that they were completely confused as to why she would all of a sudden have these memories that she was abused as a child, right? And so in looking into it, they found all these other people that said, yeah. But at the same time, too, this is in the 80s, early 90s, and you started to have all these adults coming forward.
They're all of these people coming to adulthood and during the same time, right? Because they were all kids together, and they were all experimented on together, and all brainwashed together.
That's the thing. And so they were children back in the 50s and 60s, or early 70s, right? And so you become, as an adult in the 80s and early 90s, they have all these flashbacks of these horribly traumatic events of having, stories of satanic ritual abuse, which is something to look into, trauma-based mind control, all this stuff.
Well, ritual abuse actually is just one of the main ways that they can corrupt and pervert a developing child's mind. That ritualistic abuse, and I feel like, at least for me, like I always kind of grew up hearing ritualistic abuse and immediately thought like, okay, well, it's a satanic abuse, and so therefore it's like it's isolated and it's not very frequent, and in reality it is deeply entrenched throughout our society and throughout the world, and it is very, very, very common in our communities. It trickles up. It trickled down, but it trickles up, and you can follow it. It's pretty intense.
SRA, satanic ritual abuse. So, anyway, you had all these people that come forward, and they're complaining about how that they have these memories all of a sudden about having been victimized as a child. And part of the MK Ultra programming, and part of the program in general, is to break you so you don't have these memories. Or and once you create a dissociative identity and you have all these compartmentalized personalities, basically, like they build little barriers in between them. And I get all that from a really good book by a gentleman named Fritz Springmeier. Okay, he wrote this book, and it may sound like a little crazy title, but it's called The Illuminati Formula Used to Create a Total and Undetectable Mind Control Slave. It's a wonderful book. They're really rare. So he also wrote Bloodlines of the Illuminati, which is an amazing book too. But those books are so hard to find. Like there's a paperback copy online right now for like $180, but you can get them online like PDF version. And I don't know how edited they are, but like you can get the Total Mind Control Slave one just on PDF and read. I've read about 85% of it. It's so crazy. But what Fritz Springmeier did was, like, back in the early 80s and 90s, he started working with these folks and helped to deprogram them. And he worked with people who have come forward who admitted to have been programmers. And he explains in insane detail in this book about how all the techniques and the processes, the monarch mind control programming, the very, how they do this from very, very early on, and they have, like, it's just crazy. I highly recommend looking into it.
Yeah.
But if you and it just may sound crazy. I mean, if this is the first time you're hearing about this stuff, it just may sound crazy, but
it's a lot to take in. But please do look into it.
Please do look into it.
It's so super important for
Yeah.
To not understand this issue.
Yeah.
It really cripples your ability to understand and apply so much other knowledge, to not be aware of that this has gone on, that this still goes on, and the effects of all of these thousands and thousands of people, all of these thousands of children that are, grown up. I mean, immediately, who am I thinking of? Timothy McVeigh,
Yeah, sure.
And, anyway, so.
All of them. Yeah.
And I think, we need to get into the actual things they did a little bit more, but I think if anything, like, when you hear all this stuff, I mean, it should.
Yeah.
You should. I mean, it breaks your idea of the powers that be. You know? It breaks your idea that the people above us have our best interest in mind.
And they do not.
Yeah.
I mean,
they do not.
Yeah. They only care about their own power and control and wealth expanding at the expense of everybody else. So,
absolutely.
False memory syndrome, right? We have the whole, as of recent years, the whole Me Too movement, trust all victims, believe all victims, at least investigate, right? That's been kind of the culture that's come about now. Sure. But I still don't think, but it still doesn't apply to, like, people who say that they were abused as children, or children who come forward and say they've been abused. It's still, there's still no people, like, that are going to believe all that and investigate all that, right? And so back when in 1992, all these people are coming forward, right? Instead of investigating it, they invent a new institution called the False Memory Syndrome Foundation to label all of these people as having false memories.
Which is not in the DSM.
So that's the next point. Yeah, as much as they tried to advocate for it and get all these doctors and professionals on the board of the scientific advisory board of this committee, or of this institution, they were never able to persuade the powers that be to get it adopted into the Diagnostic Statistics Manual, the DSM, which is the standard for any mental health disorders. And so it's really interesting. And so it's funny too, because they were defunct as of December 31st, 2019. So just a few months ago. They are no longer an entity. The FMSF is no longer an entity, but you can still find their websites online, fmsfonline.org.
Why did they disband this wonderful project?
Yeah, right at the very bottom of the page, it says
this wonderful project.
Yeah, it says the need for the FMS Foundation diminished dramatically over the years. So they don't really have a need for it anymore. Because because
everyone's been blanketed as nuts and they don't remember shit. So we might as well just.
They've changed their techniques. So now, after the creation of this, those probably the people that are involved in the experimentations don't survive.
Right.
They don't see the light of day. There's, like, probably a lot of underground stuff happening.
But you have to understand too that when people are abused in this way, when people have had their very psychic boundary violated, when they, I mean, and for those of us that haven't been through this level of psychological devastation, it is really, really hard to wrap your mind around. But most human beings have been through some level of trauma that was hard for them to overcome, and so to those small degrees, you can understand. But sorry,
You're great.
I way got off. What was the last thing you just said?
I don't even know.
I don't even know either. But
so it's diminished. We don't need it anymore. We've gone past.
And just the ability
for gone underground.
Yes, and so understand too that when we're talking about victims of these kinds of acts, they're so traumatized, they're so afraid, and they've been so psychologically manipulated into conceding their ability, their spiritual sovereignty to another entity outside of themselves, that they don't come forward. They're afraid to come forward and further. There's no, in their mind, there's no balance that I need justice or I've been wronged. In fact, if a lot of these victims, they feel that they are wrong. They feel that they have been, and studies of these people who have been through these mind control experiments, when we're trying to unprogram these people, they're talking about feeling like, oh, when they start to come forward, like I feel I've been a bad boy, they'll actually say these things. Adults, I've been a bad girl, or I'm in trouble now. Like it's not even really an option, and I think that's a huge thing that people who have not come from these kinds of experimental situations, it's hard for us to understand, but really, if you can get a bead on the psychology behind it, it's unlikely that they would come forward. It's unlikely that they would feel confident to do that, or even that they would feel that would be helpful. They don't even understand the distinction. And I think that's the point, that's how bad it is. That's how traumatizing that these...
I think that's one of the goals of these experiments.
Of course. Of course. Absolutely.
Is exactly that as well.
Yes.
And
so that is one of the reasons why it's underreported, not reported, not talked about, and like so many things in these areas, they get a blanket branding of, it's like, saying conspiracy theorists, or they have false memories, or they have identity disorder. They don't know what the heck happened, and it, all in an effort to suppress and undermine this powerful voice coming forward in unison, saying that this did happen, this is what has happened to us, and no, it didn't. You just don't remember.
Now, the funny thing is, so good. So, the funny thing is that if you look at so let me just say this before I go there. So now that the false memory syndrome foundation has been disbanded, do they still have any credibility? Is there still any credibility to that this is a real thing? Can we now go back and open investigations? Can we go back and say, hey, wait a minute, this thing's been it's been debunked. How do you like that?
Right.
Oh, it's been debunked. How do you like that? Yeah. So false memory, been debunked. Get out of here with that shit.
Yep.
So let's go take a look back. Now let's go a little further, okay? So now who was a part of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, okay? Let's do this. We have Harold Leaf, major in the Army Medical Corps, also did electrode research for the CIA. We have Dr. David Dingus, freaking Dingus.
What a good name.
Scientific Advisory Board, Naval and Navy Intelligence, Air Force Intelligence, and was a part of the Human Ecology Foundation. Where have we heard that? This is MK Ultra front right there. This is an interesting one. Dr. Elizabeth Loftus, she testified in defense of Ted Bundy. She was a witness on behalf, and so she apparently has no clinical experience, no expertise in child sexual abuse or traumatic memory. However, she just made a living going around serving as a high-paid expert witnesses for people accused of abusing children and stuff like that. And so this is who's making up the board, and you can go on and on and on. If you look at the list, a lot of them had to do with MK Ultra, for crying out loud, dude. Like, it's like this is insane.
Yep.
And so they're covering their bases as hard as they can. And then it's like, oh, they're on to us. Let's create a whole foundation to discredit them.
Yep.
That's how deep this goes. It's so insane. It's so insane. And here's the big nugget right here.
All right, I want you to
this is my favorite
say
part.
it.
Okay. All right. Have you guys ever heard of Louis Jolyon West? Dr. Louis Jolyon West. He was a scientific on the scientific, also known as Jolly. Oh God, Scientific Advisory Board for the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. He is basically the freaking Michael Baden of mind control. Like, you guys remember Michael Baden from our talk on. He's the forensic pathologist that did autopsies on JFK, Martin Luther King, testified in the OJ trial. Did Jeffrey Epstein's autopsy and George Floyd's autopsy. Can you, so all of the craziest, deaths in the history of mankind, this guy was involved in, right? That's Michael Baden. Look him up, dude. But now we have Jolly West, right?
Good old Jolly West.
So what are some of his credits, right? So he's the gentleman that interrogated Jack Ruby in his jail cell and concluded that he was mentally ill. You remember Jack Ruby was the gentleman that shot Lee Harvey Oswald. So Lee Harvey Oswald, the patsy who they pinned the JFK assassination on, Jack Ruby's the one who executed him. So we have Jack Ruby. Sirhan is the person who they accused of, it's kind of hard to dispute. I mean, he pulled the trigger and shot Bobby Kennedy, right? And killed him, right? But, where was his brain? Is he that Manchurian Candidate that the MK Ultra program's been working so hard to find?
I think perhaps.
Perhaps. All right. Who else do we have? So there's Patty Hearst. Patty Hearst is an interesting situation. So she was kidnapped, right? She was a famous gal back in the day, kidnapped by the Symbionese Liberation Army, SLA.
Which was I reading today? Tell me if I'm wrong on this, or maybe I just got partial information. But it was through the base in Vacaville. I think,
Something-
right? California-based
something.
that they actually came up with. They made up this whole the Liberation Army thing. I mean, there was a whole.
I don't know about that.
Well, I mean, like this ploy that they dispatched with regards to her. I don't know.
Okay.
Well, I will have to read it more in depth, and
I
then
didn't
we'll
get
connect.
that. But yeah, so basically she ended up robbing a bank, right? And the story was that she was brainwashed into.
But she was an
committing that-
heiress.
Yeah.
She was an heiress. She came from money.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's something to understand here too.
So Jolly West testified on her behalf as an expert witness during her trial. He also had contacts with Timothy McVeigh while he was in jail, and David Koresh, who is the Waco guy. We all know that, right? And of course, the grand finale here. So he operated a clinic in San Francisco that Charles Manson would visit. So literally just boom, boom, boom. Like, okay, how many coincidences do we need here? Like, he had a hand in all of these different situations where all these people committed these crimes that could fall under the umbrella of, like, God, were they mind controlled? Like, were they acting outside of their own free will? Were they doing things up and against their own self-preservation? Like, what's going on here? So Jolly West, who, by the way, was on the scientific advisory board of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation.
Wow.
Get out of here. Get out of here.
How do you like that?
Get out of here, dude. And he also killed an elephant by giving it too much LSD named Tusco. So
He did kill an elephant with too much LSD.
Yeah.
Wait, there's too much LSD?
Apparently so.
When I read about that, I was wondering, like, what was the whole point there? Because what were they gonna? I don't know, and I guess I need to read further to find out if they put like some sort of electrodes in this elephant's brain to figure out if well, right, like what they just dosed this elephant and just watched it die. Like, what was their basis of? Anyway, that was a sidebar, but
the LSD experiments were completely out of hand. It was just an occupational hazard at that point.
They were just like, let's see what it does when we.
If you worked at the CIA in this time frame, you might get dosed. I mean, that happened. Several people who worked there. There was the one guy who ran out into the streets naked, and he was freaking out. And there was Frank Olson, there's a whole story on him. Should I go there now?
Hell yeah, dude.
Okay, so Frank Olson, if you guys know, there's a whole Wormwood Netflix documentary series on him right now. I'm going to kind of touch on it, but essentially he was, he was a bacteriologist. He worked for the Army Chemical Corps, and he got drawn into MK Ultra under Gottfried and yeah, that guy.
That dude. Yeah.
Let's see. So essentially, I'll kind of go with how the CIA story goes, and then you can kind of expands. So essentially, this guy, he goes on this trip. Let's see. It was a retreat to Deep Creek Lake, Maryland, with I'm just gonna say it's Gottlieb. And Gottlieb decided that he was going to basically dose this bottle of orange liqueur and to just kind of see the effects on those who were there. There's like 10 people from the CIA on this retreat. So anyways, Frank gets dosed. He freaks out a bit, essentially. He starts kind of losing it, going into a depression is what they said. Kind of what you talked about too, like he thought he screwed up.
Yeah.
He started getting down on himself.
Right.
And
it's like self-sabotage, like they've put in self-sabotage.
Yeah. And so anyways, he goes back and forth. He's just kind of out of his mind, and this is, a couple days later. And they basically tell him he needs to get some psychiatric help, and they're going to help him. They're going to help him. And instead of taking him to a psychiatrist, in the area, they decided to take him to New York City to this Dr. Harold Abramson, who is an allergist and a pediatrician. So not much of a psychiatrist, but he was an MK Ultra operative. So they could kind of keep it in the family there and not get it out. So essentially, this guy goes to New York, and he's in a hotel with, let's see, what's this guy's name? He was the deputy for Gottlieb. Richard Lashbrook. And Richard Lashbrook says he wakes up at 2:30 in the morning to a crashing window, and Frank Olson flies out the window. He says it's either an accident or a suicide, and he falls to his death. It was 13 stories. It was Yeah. So anyways, years later, the mother didn't really want. I don't know if she knew stuff or didn't know stuff, but the kids were like very curious, like what the hell happened. This guy had 3 kids. I think the oldest was 9 at the time when it happened, and the mother, Alice, she whether she knew something or not, just kind of wanted to bury the hatchet on this one and didn't want to address what was going on. I think the kids waited until they were older and had her tell the story again, and they kind of started piecing some details and going, it doesn't really fit that my father committed suicide under these conditions.
Right.
So anyways, once the mother died, when they were going to bury her, they exhumed Frank's body, and they had another autopsy done, and they found blunt force trauma to his head, basically meaning that he was murdered. Now before that had happened, though, I kind of skipped a major piece here. So they did, when the kids looked into it, had the whole story told to them again. They kind of knew there was foul play, or I don't think they knew about the LSD until that point. They went somehow. They ended up going to the president. The president like apologized to him. Like the president of the United
I think it
States.
was Jimmy Carter, wasn't it?
No, it wasn't Jimmy Carter.
yeah.
It was Gerald Ford.
Gerald Ford, that's
Ford,
right.
Yeah. Who apologized, and the head of the CIA at that time, I think, apologized, and they did this. They did this.
I guess that's
They
okay
gave him
then.
a settlement. I think they gave him $750,000, and but it kind of like, you can't sue us now, like here's some money, you can't sue us. But
Yeah.
It kind of sounds like vaccine court.
Then they found out after that it was murder, and so
tricky.
essentially they went to look into it, and they tried to sue him again, and they took it to a judge, and there was a really good quote, because the judge basically says, like, it was Judge James Boasberg, and he dismissed the case because of the agreement in 1976 that they signed, that basically they couldn't sue him. But he had these interesting words to say. He said, while the court must limit its analysis to the 4 corners of the complaint, skeptical readers may wish to know that the public record supports many of the allegations in the family suit, as far-fetched as they may sound.
As far-fetched as they may sound.
So the judge is like, basically like, yeah, you got a case. I just can't do anything about
Yep.
it. So then further, like, Eric, the son, was still not like okay with this answer. So he went to the one place he could. He went to the press, and he got this guy Seymour Hersh of the New York Times to look into it. And he said he had a source that knew about this stuff. And he said he had a source that confirmed, yes, it was a murder, but the source would not come forth unless he got another source, because he had to go to the CIA and look at the records, and he signed. So unless there was someone else, they would know it was him.
Yeah.
So and there was this other piece that the son found at one point that I thought was really interesting. That he got this from the CIA at one point. Sorry, my notes are kind of a mess here, but so he got the 1953 Assassination Manual from the CIA.
Oh, I want to see that.
And one of the things it talked about how to get rid of someone was this idea of a contrived accident, and it said one of the great ways to do it was a fall of 75 feet or more, and you just wanted to make sure you didn't leave any wounds that could be traced back to you, and you could make it look like an accident. So it was right in the CIA manual, like what happened to this guy, and I thought, in my mind, I was like, man, he should go take that to the Clintons and get it signed. It'd be worth a ton of money.
Dude, yeah.
Yeah, but anyways,
Yeah, it's like
it sounded like a Clinton move to me. But
Hell yeah, dude. And of course,
Speaking of, am I
Go,
allowed to
jump in.
Am I allowed to say?
Unleash.
So with Bill Clinton's anti-terrorist bill that he wasn't getting pushed through, and then all of a sudden we have Kaczynski, right? Theodore Kaczynski, the Unabomber.
Kaczynski. Yes, I'm glad you touched on that. Yes.
So we have Theodore Kaczynski, who was an MK Ultra.
200 hours over
200 hours he was experimented on.
LSD,
he was
definite
super intelligent.
Yep.
And he was professor at one of a prestigious school. Do you remember which one was it? Harvard, Yale? I don't remember.
I
offhand.
think his experimentation happened at Harvard.
At Harvard.
He was,
and then anyway, so we have Bill Clinton's anti-terrorist bill not going through, and then all of a sudden we have this Unabomber who has been subject to MK Ultra's experiments and tortures come through and cause an issue within our nation that allowed that to go right through. And so I'm going to jump straight ahead even further. I'm going to say all the dark stuff and talk about 9/11 and the Patriot Act. Okay. So I feel like that there is a lot of veins that are all feeding all of these grander agendas that stemmed from and as a result of the experimentation and these all of these methods that they use to gain control of human beings' mental capabilities.
Yeah, what's going on right now? I mean, are we being mind controlled right now? Are we being subjected to that? Do you think the social media has anything to do with that? Do you guys think that the NBCs and the CBSs and the MSNBCs and all that? Do you think they have any role in this now? Do you think that
media sound bites?
Do you think that they've perfected this at all over the last?
Well, what
50
about
years?
the fluoride in our water? What about the chemicals in our vaccines? What about the GMO in our food? What about the chemtrails, the 5G towers, and then the public, of course, mass public indoctrination?
If you mention any of those things, you're automatically crazy. You're a conspiracy theorist, dude.
That's
me. But look into it, folks. Look into it, folks. I also you reminded me too, so I'm glad you touched on the Kaczynski thing because it's also worth noting too that and we mentioned there was 80 some facilities throughout the world. There was 2 overseas bases that they were used for MK Ultra experiments. One of them was in Manila, which is the capital of the Philippines, and the other one was at Sugi Naval Base, which just so happened to be where a young man named Lee Harvey Oswald was stationed when he was 17 years old in the Marine Corps. So
just so happens. There you go. They all promise to be good, though.
They all promise.
So it's all legit.
Yep. So I think that any conversation about MK Ultra would be remiss without a little touching on Operation Midnight Climax.
Ooh, what a wonderful band name you just came up with, Scott.
Yeah.
I have to say, you look at MK Ultra, for me as a musician, I'm just thinking, there's band names all over the place. There's an album over here,
Elephant Overdose.
Yeah, come on. Yeah, let's get some.
Tusco.
Just MK Ultra itself, you know.
Yep.
Operation Artichoke.
Yeah.
Come on, good band names. But anyways, there's all kinds of experiments. We're going to touch on a couple, but just this one, Operation Midnight Climax. This kind of gives you a picture of how far they would go, So anyways, so the CIA has all these safe houses in San Francisco. And so what they did, and this is 1954, they set them up as brothels, and they hired prostitutes on the CIA payroll. Yep. Let's just be clear there. And they would lure unsuspecting men into these, and they would have one-way mirrors, and they'd be on the other side, and they would dose these guys. And they would spike their drinks with LSD, and then they would just observe and record them, and they would want to see if they could prompt them to confess things. So a lot of it was about getting these confessions and seeing if they could use LSD to break people down and to say things they didn't want to say. And they would pick these guys they were, so they would be too embarrassed to talk about it, So they wouldn't let it out, And they would use things like sexual blackmail. I wonder if they just quit that after this.
Yeah, they definitely quit that in
probably
1973.
the only time.
They've never done that since 1973.
I don't think so either at all.
Yeah, surveillance technology, and then just the use of the mind-altering drugs in field ops. And some of these cases though, they would interrogate these guys after under bright lights, and they would tell them that their trips would be extended if they didn't give up all of their secrets. And most of these were done on CIA employees, U.S. military personnel, and agents suspected working for the other side during the Cold War. So they just, but just think about that for a second. And this is very documented. We know 100% for sure there is proof beyond a shadow of a doubt the CIA had prostitutes that they were luring in their own people and people that were, in the army and whatnot. And they were setting up these sexual encounters, and then they were dosing them and watching them and interrogating them.
And they were apparently doing drugs themselves. They were getting
That's what I was reading too. Yeah, they totally were.
Party, dude.
Yep.
Yeah. Totally. It gets down to look how many doses of acid. The acid in our country is because of the CIA. But I mean, I think it comes down to
a future episode.
A bigger thing.
Laurel Canyon, baby.
I mean, you look at this, it's like, would there even be drug trafficking without the CIA?
No.
Like,
Afghanistan, poppy fields in Afghanistan, freaking Iran-Contra, dude. Look into Mena, Arkansas, cocaine. Look at Freeway Rick Ross. Look at Gary Webb, R.I.P. May he rest in peace, man.
But anyways, Operation Midnight Climax, quite a crazy story. Just look into yourself. And I mean, do you trust the CIA? Do you trust the government? I mean, this is documented stuff. And the big thing about these experiments and things like that, I mean, this is in 75 when Watergate's happening. I mean, they're shutting this thing down and they're burning all the files.
Yeah, in 1973,
whatnot.
they started burning the files. It was under CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of all the evidence. So what evidence we do have is just the documents that survived by accident. They destroyed so much of their own tombs because he said they had too much paper. The CIA had too much paper.
Too much paper.
So all the MK Ultra documents needed to be destroyed. And so what we do know of it, what we do have of it, what got exposed in the church committees, is all the stuff that was left by accident. So.
So this is the drop of water in the pond of what it was.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you can think whatever you want about what's going on today or whatnot, but like this stuff is documented. And do you really, really think that they put this much effort and time into these experiments to just burn them up and let them go?
No, they just got better at covering it up and going underground with it. 100%. Damn. What do you guys think, man? We're at an hour 11.
111, that's kind of a spooky number. Let's keep going, guys. Come on. Well, I don't want any numerology getting on us here.
I think what we're going to do is we're going to call it, and then we're going to come at you with a bonus episode here in a few days. We got a fun little game we're going to play called Guess the Date.
Love
Boom.
it.
So, you guys have any final thoughts?
Now I'm on the spot. What are my final thoughts? So my final thoughts are, I guess I wrote something, and I wrote it as it's written because I copied it from the internet. But I do want to read it. I know we sort of passed over it probably. I should have interjected a while ago.
Please.
So Dr. Green, so he was originally, and I wish I would have written this down, but he was a Nazi doctor that they brought over. They recruited him to serve in the U.S. Army to teach psychiatrists mind control techniques that he had developed. And I want to touch on, and my heart always goes to the innocence. My heart is very much for children and the exploitation of children, and to bring to light the exploitation of children. And I always feel like I would be doing everything that I'm about a disservice to not touch on it when it's applicable. So I want to quote Dr. Green saying, their experiments with children raised in various environments demonstrated that certain types of trauma focused on wounding specific aspects of the intrapsychic world. Recognizing that each child is unique, allowed researchers in mind control to be able to make some identification of specific traumas during various developmental stages. And anyone who's worked with children, we all understand like the developmental stages of children and how teaching them empathy and picking them up when they cry, and if they're in, all of these things, they develop and they form a whole psyche. And that is so crucial when we're talking about anything in life. A full and developed psyche that is steeped in love and has the ability to have discernment and logic and control and reason and all of these things that develop a healthy human being. So essentially what we have is the CIA with MK Ultra completely perverting just thousands and thousands of children's minds. And the way that they did that, and this is the diabolical, insidious part, is they're taking very, very young children, and often they're taking orphans. They're taking children who've already been traumatized, who already have had a rough go, who are already psychologically diminished because of whatever other instances that they've been through to that point. At any rate, so they have identified specific traumas during various developmental stages in life of a child that would cause sufficient wounding, and also the specific nurturing experiences during these same developmental states that were necessary to prevent trauma-induced schizophrenia, narcissistic personality disorder, which that's rampant throughout our government and rampant throughout our society. It's absolutely diabolical. And we're talking about, in all of this, psychopathic personality, other mental disorders, we're talking about human beings that have no ability to have empathy. This is huge.
Well, it's also a thing that the elites employ with their own children too.
Absolutely,
they use these strategies so they can cultivate children that don't have empathy or that will do what they need to do to maintain
family.
No matter at the harm and risk to themselves, as we've already discussed. And so the ability to take away an individual, and I think that Scott and I maybe discussed sort of the wounding of the pineal gland too. We're talking about corrupting the spiritual center. I mean, believe what you want, but the mind is very, very complicated, and there are studies to suggest and to follow up on any of these ideas. But to cause this wounding and this psychological break and this disruption by way of completely perverting these experiences that would allow them to remain safe, that would allow them to develop whole and healthy. To have individuals who don't have empathy means that these individuals essentially don't have a conscience, and that is it is a huge deal, because we're talking about tens of thousands of people amongst us and in society that this was deliberate. I mean, this happens with, neglectful parents and abusive parents, and there's all kinds of situations where this can happen, but we're talking about our government employing human beings that did this to the most innocent among us, and those innocents are walking around us now, not so innocent anymore, perhaps through no fault of their own, but with no ability to form human connection, with no ability to have empathy or to relate to somebody else's pain or their joy. I mean, they simply can't do it. And so when we're also talking about people coming forward, why would they? They have no self-love. They can't. Absolutely. So anyways, I guess I just wanted to touch on that. I'm not sure if I...
That's great.
So.
Hell yeah.
So is that it? Are we going? What do you got?
Any final thoughts, Ed?
The only thing I would say is I have a hard time talking about this sometimes without some humor involved and laughing a little bit. It. But at the same time, this is really sick shit. Yeah. It's really sick shit, and the psyop of it all is that it feels like, oh, that's 50s, 60s, 70s. It's like they were so barbaric, and they don't. It feels like it's not right here.
We're so much more civilized today.
That's not the truth. That's just not the truth, and that's kind of back to the goal of what our whole thing is, to shed some light. This stuff did not stop in 1975. It's been worked on and perfected since.
Cool.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's great. Another good one in the bank, folks.
I think it's a good one.
Yeah, you want to take us out, Megan?
All right. Well, everybody, just thank you so much for coming with us on this journey as we look into these deeper truths. They're uncomfortable, but it's so important for us all to have this knowledge and this understanding. As scary and as much as it pushes our boundaries, it really does give us a power and control that we did not have before. Knowledge is very much power. So I just want to say that we wish you intellectual prosperity, and good night.
Good night.
Good night.